The desert sun beat down mercilessly on Fort Apache as Thomas Mackenzie stumbled through the wooden gates, his uniform torn and his eyes wild with exhaustion. The other soldiers stared at him with a mixture of pity and disgust. For the third time in 2 months, Mackenzie had returned alone from a patrol, claiming he had survived an Apache attack through what he called invisible warfare. His commanding officer, Colonel Hayes, barely looked up from his desk when Mackenzie entered his office. "Another miraculous escape, Mackenzie?" Hayes asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The colonel had grown tired of Mackenzie's strange reports about using shadows, animal calls, and what seemed like magic to outwit Apache warriors. To Hayes, these stories sounded like the desperate lies of a coward who abandoned his men to save himself. Mackenzie stood at attention, his weathered face showing the strain of months in the Arizona Territory. He had joined the cavalry 3 years earlier, full of hope and determination to serve his country. But the Apache Wars had changed him in ways that other soldiers couldn't understand. While they relied on standard military tactics, Mackenzie had learned to think like his enemies. He studied their movements, learned their language, and most importantly, he understood their connection to the land. "Sir, I need to explain what really happened out there," Mackenzie began, but Hayes waved him off. The colonel had heard enough of Mackenzie's wild tales. In Hayes' mind, a good soldier followed orders and fought with honor, not with the strange methods Mackenzie described. The other men in the unit whispered behind Mackenzie's back, calling him crazy and unreliable. The truth was that Mackenzie had discovered something remarkable during his time in the desert. He had learned to communicate with Apache scouts through a complex system of signals and sounds that mimicked the natural environment. He could move through the landscape almost invisibly, using techniques he had observed from the native people themselves. But explaining this to his fellow soldiers was impossible. They saw only a man who seemed to have lost his mind to the harsh realities of frontier warfare. Dr. Samuel Richardson, the fort's medical officer, had been watching Mackenzie closely for weeks. The doctor believed that Mackenzie was suffering from what he called desert madness, a condition he thought affected men who spent too much time alone in the wilderness. Richardson had recommended that Mackenzie be sent back east for treatment, but Hayes wanted to give the soldier one more chance to prove himself. Mackenzie's reputation among the enlisted men had reached a breaking point. They refused to go on patrol with him, believing that his presence would bring bad luck or even death. Some claimed that Mackenzie talked to himself during night watches, practicing what sounded like Apache war cries. Others swore they had seen him drawing strange symbols in the dirt around the campfire. These behaviors only reinforced their belief that their fellow soldier had lost his grip on reality. The isolation was taking its toll on Mackenzie, but he remained determined to prove that his methods could save lives. He spent his free time studying maps of the territory, marking locations where Apache bands were known to travel. He practiced the calls and signals he had learned, refining his ability to communicate across great distances without being detected by enemy scouts. Mackenzie knew that war was changing, and survival required adaptation. Colonel Hayes faced pressure from his superiors to maintain order and discipline in his command. The Apache threat was real and growing, with reports of increasing attacks on settlements and supply convoys throughout the territory. Hayes needed soldiers he could trust, not men who seemed to have been broken by the stress of combat. He made the difficult decision to give Mackenzie one final assignment, knowing that failure would mean the end of the soldier's military career. The assignment would test everything Mackenzie had learned about survival and warfare in the desert. Hayes planned to send him out with a small patrol to investigate reports of Apache activity near a strategic pass. If Mackenzie could successfully complete this mission using conventional methods, he would be given another chance. If he failed or returned with another unbelievable story, he would be declared unfit for duty and sent away from the frontier forever. The morning of Mackenzie's final patrol arrived with an ominous stillness that settled over Fort Apache like a heavy blanket. Even the usually chattering birds seemed to sense that something significant was about to unfold. Mackenzie prepared his gear with meticulous care, checking every piece of equipment while the other soldiers watched from a distance. They had volunteered for this mission reluctantly, and only because Colonel Hayes had made it clear that refusing orders would result in serious consequences. Sergeant Williams, a veteran of 15 years on the frontier, led the small patrol of 6 men. Williams had served with distinction in numerous campaigns against hostile tribes, but he had never worked with someone like Mackenzie. The sergeant's experience told him that Mackenzie's behavior was dangerous and unpredictable, yet something about the man's intense focus suggested there might be more to his story than simple madness. As the patrol rode out through the desert morning, Mackenzie noticed signs that the others missed completely. Broken twigs arranged in specific patterns, stones placed in unusual formations, and subtle changes in the natural landscape all told him that Apache scouts had been watching the fort for days. He tried to share these observations with Sergeant Williams, but the veteran soldier dismissed them as more evidence of Mackenzie's unstable mental condition. The patrol's destination was Devil's Canyon, a narrow pass through the mountains where several supply convoys had been attacked in recent weeks. Intelligence reports suggested that a large Apache band was using the area as a base for raids against military and civilian targets throughout the territory. Colonel Hayes had ordered the patrol to gather information about enemy movements and report back with recommendations for a larger military operation. Mackenzie, his unique understanding of Apache tactics, told him that their patrol was walking into a carefully prepared trap. The enemy had been observing Fort Apache for weeks, learning the patterns of military patrols and identifying the best opportunities for ambush. Devil's Canyon provided the perfect location for such an attack, with high walls that would prevent escape and numerous hiding places for warriors to launch a surprise assault. As they traveled deeper into hostile territory, Mackenzie began using the communication methods he had developed during his previous encounters with Apache scouts. He made subtle hand signals and produced barely audible sounds that mimicked the calls of desert animals. To his fellow soldiers, these behaviors confirmed their worst fears about his mental stability. They began to question whether Mackenzie might actually be working with the enemy, using their patrol to deliver information about military movements. The tension within the patrol reached a breaking point when Mackenzie suddenly ordered everyone to dismount and take cover behind a cluster of rocks. Williams demanded an explanation, but Mackenzie could only point to signs that were invisible to the others. He had detected the presence of Apache scouts watching their movement from elevated positions around the canyon. The enemy was preparing to attack, but Mackenzie's warning seemed like another episode of paranoid delusion to his fellow soldiers. Williams faced an impossible decision as the patrol leader. His military training told him to follow established procedures and continue toward their objective, but Mackenzie's intense conviction gave him pause. The sergeant had survived 15 years on the frontier by trusting his instincts, and something about this situation felt different from their previous encounters with Mackenzie's strange behavior. The other soldiers in the patrol were becoming increasingly agitated as Mackenzie continued to insist that they were surrounded by enemy warriors. Private Johnson, the youngest member of the group, began to panic as he imagined Apache fighters closing in from all directions. Corporal Martinez, a steady veteran of frontier warfare, tried to maintain order while Williams decided their next course of action. Mackenzie knew that time was running out for all of them. His ability to read the subtle signs of Apache presence had saved his life multiple times, but convincing others to trust his methods had proven impossible. The warriors watching their patrol were probably reporting their position to a larger force, and soon the small group of soldiers would face overwhelming odds in terrain that heavily favored their enemies. As the sun climbed higher in the desert sky, Mackenzie made a desperate decision that would change everything. He began to implement the most dangerous part of his survival strategy, knowing that his actions would either vindicate his methods or confirm everyone's belief that he had finally lost his mind completely. The next few hours would determine not only his own fate, but the lives of every man in the patrol. Without warning, Mackenzie suddenly stood up from behind the rocks and began walking directly toward the canyon walls, where he claimed Apache scouts were hiding. His fellow soldiers watched in horror as he raised his hands above his head and started making what sounded like animal calls mixed with human speech. To Sergeant Williams and the others, this appeared to be the final evidence that Mackenzie had completely lost his mind and was about to get them all killed. "Get down, you fool," Williams hissed, but Mackenzie continued walking forward with steady determination. The sounds coming from his throat were unlike anything the other soldiers had ever heard. They combined the harsh calls of desert hawks with rhythmic patterns that seemed almost like a primitive language. Mackenzie's movements were deliberate and purposeful, as if he was following a script that only he could understand. What the other soldiers couldn't see was the subtle response Mackenzie was receiving from the hidden Apache scouts. Years of careful observation had taught him to recognize the nearly invisible signals that warriors used to communicate across great distances: a flash of reflected sunlight from a carefully positioned piece of metal, the movement of a single branch in windless air, and the arrangement of stones in specific patterns all told Mackenzie that his message was being received and understood. The Apache scouts watching the patrol were as surprised as the soldiers by Mackenzie's behavior. They had been preparing to signal their war party for an attack, but the strange soldiers' actions gave them pause. Mackenzie was using a combination of traditional Apache communication methods and universal signs of peaceful intent that transcended tribal boundaries. His message was simple but clear. He sought dialogue, not conflict. Chief Running Bear, the leader of the Apache band, had been observing Mackenzie's patrols for months from a distance. Unlike the other soldiers who moved through the desert like invaders, Mackenzie showed respect for the land and demonstrated understanding of native ways. The chief had instructed his scouts to study this unusual soldier, and their reports had convinced him that Mackenzie might be different from the typical cavalry troops. As Mackenzie continued his approach toward the canyon walls, one of the Apache scouts finally revealed himself on a high ledge. The warrior stood motionless for several seconds, then began to mirror some of Mackenzie's hand signals. This exchange was conducted in complete silence, with both men using a complex system of gestures that conveyed basic intentions and warnings. Mackenzie learned that his patrol was indeed surrounded, but the Apache force was willing to allow safe passage in exchange for specific information. Sergeant Williams and the other soldiers watched this incredible scene unfold with growing amazement and terror. They could see the Apache scout clearly now, and they realized that Mackenzie had been telling the truth about enemy presence in the area. More disturbing was the apparent communication taking place between Mackenzie and the warrior, which suggested a level of cooperation that bordered on treason in their minds. The negotiation between Mackenzie and the Apache scout continued for nearly an hour, with both men using increasingly complex signals to discuss terms. Mackenzie learned that a massive war party of over 300 Apache fighters was gathering in the mountains for a coordinated attack on Fort Apache and several nearby settlements. The chief was willing to delay this attack and potentially avoid bloodshed altogether if Mackenzie could provide assurance that future military patrols would respect certain sacred areas and avoid unnecessary destruction of Apache resources. Mackenzie faced an agonizing decision as he realized the true scope of the situation. His fellow soldiers were convinced that he was either insane or working with the enemy, but he now possessed information that could save hundreds of lives on both sides of the conflict. The Apache war party represented the largest gathering of hostile forces in the territory's history, and their planned attack would result in massive casualties among military personnel and civilian settlers. The other members of the patrol were becoming increasingly agitated as they watched Mackenzie's extended communication with the Apache scout. Private Johnson was convinced that Mackenzie was arranging for their capture or execution, while Corporal Martinez began to consider the possibility that they might need to shoot Mackenzie to prevent him from betraying military secrets to the enemy. As the sun reached its highest point in the desert sky, Mackenzie finally concluded his negotiations with the Apache scout and began walking back toward his fellow soldiers. The expression on his face was grim but determined, and he carried information that would either save Fort Apache or confirm everyone's worst suspicions about his loyalty and sanity. The next few minutes would determine whether his unconventional methods could prevent a massacre that would change the course of the Apache wars forever. Mackenzie returned to his fellow soldiers with urgent news that seemed impossible to believe. He explained that the Apache scout had revealed plans for a massive coordinated attack involving over 300 warriors from multiple bands. The assault was scheduled to begin at dawn the following day, targeting Fort Apache, the nearby settlement of Pine Ridge, and 2 strategic supply depots simultaneously. The scope and timing of this operation would overwhelm the scattered military forces in the territory and result in devastating casualties. Sergeant Williams listened to Mackenzie's report with growing skepticism and alarm. The idea that Mackenzie could have learned such detailed military intelligence through his strange communication with the Apache scout seemed preposterous. Williams suspected that Mackenzie had either fabricated this information as part of his ongoing mental breakdown, or worse, that he was working with the enemy to spread false intelligence that would cause confusion and panic among military commanders. The other soldiers in the patrol shared Williams's doubts about Mackenzie's credibility. Private Johnson openly accused Mackenzie of making up stories to explain his traitorous behavior, while Corporal Martinez suggested that they should arrest Mackenzie immediately and return him to Fort Apache for court-martial proceedings. The patrol was splitting apart as the men argued about whether to trust Mackenzie's intelligence or treat him as an enemy. Collaborator Mackenzie understood that his fellow soldiers' suspicions were reasonable given his unconventional methods and their lack of understanding about Apache culture and communication. But he also knew that hundreds of lives depended on getting this critical intelligence back to Fort Apache before the coordinated attack could begin. He faced the impossible task of convincing skeptical military leaders to take action based on information gathered through methods they considered either impossible or treasonous. The Apache scout who had communicated with Mackenzie disappeared back into the canyon walls as silently as he had appeared, leaving no trace of the extraordinary negotiation that had just taken place. Chief Running Bear had instructed his warrior to share this intelligence with Mackenzie, because the chief hoped to avoid unnecessary bloodshed while still achieving his strategic objectives. The Apache leader recognized that Mackenzie was different from other soldiers and might be able to prevent a massacre that would ultimately harm both sides. As the patrol prepared to return to Fort Apache, Mackenzie tried to explain the broader context of what he had learned during his communication with the Apache scout. The planned attack was not simply another raid for horses and supplies, but rather a coordinated effort to drive all military forces out of the territory permanently. The Apache bands had united under Chief Running Bear's leadership for the first time in years, creating a fighting force that could overwhelm any individual military installation. Williams made the difficult decision to return immediately to Fort Apache with Mackenzie's intelligence report. Despite his serious doubts about its accuracy, the sergeant's military experience told him that even false intelligence about such a massive threat needed to be reported to superior officers for evaluation. If Mackenzie was telling the truth, the lives of everyone at Fort Apache depended on immediate defensive preparations. If he was lying or delusional, the consequences of not reporting the information could be equally severe. The ride back to Fort Apache was tense and silent, as each member of the patrol struggled with questions about Mackenzie's loyalty and mental stability. The desert landscape that had seemed peaceful during their outbound journey now appeared threatening and hostile, with every rock formation and cluster of vegetation potentially hiding enemy scouts. Mackenzie's warnings about Apache surveillance suddenly seemed more credible as the soldiers began to notice signs they had previously ignored. During the return journey, Mackenzie continued to observe and interpret subtle signs of Apache activity throughout the region. The enemy had positioned scouts at strategic locations along all major routes leading to Fort Apache, confirming that a large-scale operation was indeed being planned. Mackenzie tried to share these observations with his fellow soldiers, but they remained convinced that his behavior was evidence of either madness or treason. As Fort Apache came into view in the distance, Mackenzie knew that the next few hours would determine his fate and potentially the survival of everyone in the territory. Colonel Hayes would have to decide whether to trust intelligence gathered through methods that violated every principle of conventional military doctrine. The alternative was to ignore a warning that could prevent one of the worst military disasters in the history of the Apache Wars. The patrol approached the fort's gates as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Mackenzie carried information that could save hundreds of lives, but convincing others to believe him would require overcoming months of suspicion and distrust. The true test of his unconventional methods was about to begin as he faced the challenge of turning enemies into allies through the power of truth and desperate necessity. Colonel Hayes listened to Sergeant Williams' report with growing incredulity and anger. The idea that Mackenzie had somehow negotiated with Apache scouts and obtained detailed intelligence about a massive coordinated attack seemed like the desperate fantasy of a man who had finally lost all connection to reality. Hayes was convinced that Mackenzie had fabricated this elaborate story to explain his treasonous communication with enemy forces, and he ordered the soldier placed under immediate arrest pending a full investigation. Dr. Richardson examined Mackenzie and declared him mentally unfit for duty, recommending immediate transfer to a military hospital back east for treatment of what he diagnosed as severe combat-induced psychosis. The doctor believed that months of isolation and stress in the desert had caused Mackenzie to create elaborate fantasies about communicating with Apache warriors. Richardson's medical opinion carried significant weight with Colonel Hayes, who was already predisposed to view Mackenzie as unreliable and potentially dangerous. Mackenzie found himself confined to the fort's guardhouse while military officials debated his fate and the credibility of his intelligence report. Through the small barred window of his cell, he could see Apache signal fires beginning to appear on distant mountain peaks as the sun set. These fires confirmed that the coordinated attack was proceeding according to the timeline he had learned from the Apache scout. But no one at Fort Apache was prepared to believe his warnings. As night fell, Mackenzie's desperation grew as he realized that hundreds of lives would be lost because of his inability to convince others of the truth. He had spent months developing unconventional methods that could prevent bloodshed and save both military personnel and civilian settlers. But his fellow soldiers saw only the behavior of a madman or traitor. The tragedy was that his methods actually worked, but explaining them required people to abandon their preconceived notions about warfare and communication. Captain Morrison, the fort's intelligence officer, spent the evening reviewing Mackenzie's previous patrol reports and trying to find patterns that might support or contradict his latest claims. Morrison discovered that many of Mackenzie's seemingly impossible survival stories could be verified through independent sources and physical evidence. More importantly, Mackenzie's reports about Apache movements and activities had proven remarkably accurate, even when they seemed to contradict conventional military intelligence. While Mackenzie remained imprisoned, Apache scouts began moving into final positions around Fort Apache and the nearby settlement of Pine Ridge. Chief Running Bear had hoped that his communication with Mackenzie would lead to a peaceful resolution, but the failure of military leaders to respond to the warning meant that the coordinated attack would proceed as originally planned. The chief felt genuine regret about the bloodshed that would follow, but he could not allow this opportunity to drive out the military forces to pass unused. Dr. Richardson continued to insist that Mackenzie's claims were the product of mental illness, but Captain Morrison began to have serious doubts about this diagnosis. The intelligence officer had spent years studying Apache tactics and movements, and many details in Mackenzie's report were consistent with known patterns of tribal warfare. More disturbing was the accuracy of Mackenzie's predictions about Apache signal fires and scout movements, which suggested that his intelligence might be genuine. Colonel Hayes faced the most difficult decision of his military career as reports of increased Apache activity throughout the region began to reach Fort Apache. If Mackenzie's intelligence was accurate, the coordinated attack would begin in less than 12 hours with devastating consequences for everyone in the territory. If Mackenzie was lying or delusional, preparing defenses based on his false intelligence would waste valuable resources and potentially leave the fort vulnerable to attack from unexpected directions. As midnight approached, the evidence supporting Mackenzie's warnings continued to accumulate, despite the medical opinion that he was mentally incompetent. Sentries reported unusual Apache activity near all major approaches to the fort, and smoke signals could be seen throughout the surrounding mountains. Captain Morrison compiled this information into a comprehensive report that painted a disturbing picture of coordinated enemy preparation for a major offensive operation. The breaking point came when Private Henderson, who was on guard duty at the fort's main gate, reported seeing a large group of Apache warriors moving through the valley below Fort Apache. The private sighting confirmed that enemy forces were indeed gathering for an attack, just as Mackenzie had predicted. This independent verification of Mackenzie's intelligence forced Colonel Hayes to reconsider his assumptions about the imprisoned soldiers' mental state and the credibility of his warnings. Mackenzie could hear the increased activity throughout Fort Apache as soldiers began emergency preparations for a possible attack. From his cell window, He watched signal fires spreading across the mountain ridges like a deadly constellation announcing the approach of dawn and the beginning of what could become the largest military disaster in the territory's history. His unconventional methods had provided the intelligence needed to prevent this tragedy. But convincing others to act on that intelligence was proving to be the greatest challenge of all. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Colonel Hayes made the fateful decision to release Mackenzie from confinement and place him in command of the fort's defensive preparations. The mounting evidence of Apache activity throughout the region had finally convinced the colonel that Mackenzie's intelligence might be genuine, regardless of how it had been obtained. Hayes recognized that Mackenzie's unconventional methods and understanding of Apache tactics might be their only hope of surviving the coordinated attack that seemed increasingly certain to occur at dawn. Mackenzie immediately began implementing defensive strategies that seemed strange and counterintuitive to the other soldiers at Fort Apache. Instead of concentrating all available forces behind the fort's walls, he ordered small groups of men to positions in the surrounding desert, where they could use the same invisible warfare techniques he had developed during his months of studying Apache methods. These positions would allow the defenders to disrupt the coordinated attack by striking from unexpected directions. The soldiers who had previously dismissed Mackenzie as insane now found themselves following his orders with desperate hope that his methods might actually work. Sergeant Williams, who had led the patrol that brought back Mackenzie's intelligence, volunteered to command one of the advanced defensive positions despite his earlier doubts about Mackenzie's mental stability. The veteran sergeant was beginning to understand that conventional military tactics might be inadequate against the massive Apache force gathering in the mountains. Mackenzie's defensive plan relied heavily on the communication methods he had learned through his study of Apache culture and warfare. He positioned men with specific knowledge of animal calls and natural sounds at key locations, where they could coordinate movements without using traditional military signals that enemy scouts would easily recognize. This communication network would allow the scattered defensive positions to respond quickly to changing conditions during the battle. As dawn approached, Apache scouts reported to Chief Running Bear that the soldiers at Fort Apache were behaving in unexpected ways. Instead of the predictable defensive preparations that characterized previous military responses, the fort's defenders seemed to be implementing tactics that showed understanding of Apache warfare methods. The chief realized that Mackenzie had somehow convinced his commanders to take the intelligence warning seriously and adapt their strategy accordingly. The coordinated Apache attack began at first light with simultaneous assaults on Fort Apache, Pine Ridge Settlement, and the two supply depots exactly as Mackenzie had predicted. However, the attackers immediately encountered unexpected resistance from defensive positions that seemed to appear and disappear like spirits in the desert landscape. Mackenzie's advanced defensive positions used the same stealth and mobility tactics that Apache warriors employed, creating confusion among the attacking forces. Chief Running Bear led the main assault on Fort Apache with over 200 warriors, expecting to overwhelm the fort's defenses within the first hour of fighting. Instead, he found his forces being harassed by small groups of soldiers who seemed to understand Apache tactics and communication methods. These defenders moved through the desert terrain with skill that rivaled his own warriors, appearing from concealed positions to strike at vulnerable points in the Apache formation. The battle that followed was unlike any previous engagement in the Apache Wars, with both sides employing similar tactics and fighting methods. Mackenzie's defensive positions disrupted the coordinated nature of the Apache attack by forcing the warriors to respond to threats from multiple directions simultaneously. The invisible warfare techniques that had once seemed like evidence of Mackenzie's insanity were now proving their effectiveness against overwhelming numerical odds. Private Johnson, who had been among Mackenzie's harshest critics during the patrol, found himself commanding a defensive position that successfully repelled 3 separate Apache charges using the stealth and communication methods Mackenzie had taught him. The young soldier began to understand that Mackenzie's strange behavior had actually been advanced training in survival techniques that conventional military doctrine couldn't provide. As the morning progressed, the Apache assault began to lose momentum as the attacking forces struggled to coordinate their movements against defenders who seemed to anticipate every tactical decision. Chief Running Bear realized that his intelligence about Fort Apache's defensive capabilities had been completely wrong, and that the soldiers were fighting with skills and knowledge that suggested extensive study of Apache warfare methods. Mackenzie moved between the various defensive positions throughout the battle, using his communication skills to coordinate the overall defense while maintaining the element of surprise that was crucial to their success. His ability to think like Apache warriors while commanding American soldiers created a unique tactical advantage that neither side had ever experienced before. The tide of battle began to turn as the scattered Apache forces found themselves unable to maintain the coordinated attack that had been essential to their strategy. Mackenzie's defensive network was systematically disrupting their communication and movement, forcing the warriors to fight as isolated groups rather than as a unified force. The unconventional tactics that had once branded him as insane were now saving hundreds of lives on both sides of the conflict. By midday, the Apache attack had completely collapsed as Chief Running Bear ordered his warriors to withdraw from all 4 battle sites. The coordinated assault that was supposed to drive military forces out of the territory permanently had been turned into a devastating defeat by Mackenzie's unconventional defensive tactics. Over 300 Apache fighters had been stopped in their tracks by a much smaller force that used the warriors' own methods against them with devastating effectiveness. Mackenzie found Chief Running Bear during the withdrawal and requested a final negotiation using the same communication methods that had warned of the attack. The Apache chief agreed to meet with Mackenzie in a neutral location between the opposing forces. Recognizing that this unusual soldier had demonstrated genuine understanding of Apache culture and warfare, both men knew that this conversation could determine whether the conflict would continue indefinitely or lead to a lasting peace. The negotiation between Mackenzie and Chief Running Bear lasted for several hours as both men discussed the possibility of coexistence rather than continued warfare. Mackenzie explained that his methods were based on respect for Apache knowledge and traditions, not an attempt to destroy them. The chief admitted that Mackenzie had proven himself to be a worthy opponent who understood the true nature of warfare in the desert, and he was willing to consider alternatives to endless conflict. Colonel Hayes watched from a distance as Mackenzie conducted his negotiations with Chief Running Bear, finally beginning to understand the true nature of his subordinate's abilities. The colonel realized that Mackenzie's strange behavior had actually been evidence of sophisticated intelligence gathering and tactical innovation that surpassed anything taught in military academies. Hayes felt both amazement and regret as he recognized how close he had come to destroying the career of the most valuable soldier under his command. The agreement that emerged from Mackenzie's negotiations established clear boundaries between military installations and Apache territories, with provisions for communication channels that would prevent future misunderstandings from escalating into warfare. Chief Running Bear agreed to end raids against military targets and civilian settlements in exchange for recognition of Apache sovereignty over specific areas and guarantees that sacred sites would be protected from military interference. Dr. Richardson found himself forced to reconsider his diagnosis of Mackenzie's mental condition as the evidence of the soldier's tactical genius became undeniable. The doctor realized that what he had interpreted as symptoms of psychosis were actually signs of advanced adaptation to the unique challenges of frontier warfare. Richardson's medical training had been inadequate to recognize the difference between mental illness and innovative thinking under extreme circumstances. News of Mackenzie's success spread throughout the territory as reports of the failed Apache attack reached military commanders and civilian leaders. The coordinated assault that should have resulted in massive casualties and the loss of strategic positions had been turned into a decisive victory through the application of unconventional tactics that challenged every assumption about frontier warfare. Mackenzie's reputation was transformed overnight, from that of a dangerous madman to a tactical genius who had saved hundreds of lives. Sergeant Williams publicly apologized to Mackenzie for doubting his intelligence and methods, acknowledging that the veteran soldier's experience had been inadequate to recognize the value of Mackenzie's innovations. Williams requested permission to study Mackenzie's techniques so that he could train other soldiers in the invisible warfare methods that had proven so effective against overwhelming odds. The sergeant wanted to ensure that future patrols would be prepared to survive encounters with hostile forces. Mackenzie was promoted to the rank of captain and given command of a special unit, trained in the unconventional warfare methods he had developed. During his months of study and experimentation, his techniques became the foundation for a new approach to frontier military operations that emphasized understanding of local cultures and environments, rather than reliance on standard tactics that were poorly suited to desert warfare. The peace agreement negotiated between Mackenzie and Chief Running Bear lasted for over 20 years, bringing stability to a region that had been plagued by constant warfare and bloodshed. Mackenzie's willingness to learn from his enemies and adapt his methods to local conditions had achieved what conventional military force could never accomplish. His story became legendary among both soldiers and Apache warriors, as an example of how understanding and respect could triumph over prejudice and violence. Years later, Mackenzie reflected on the events that had transformed him from an outcast branded as insane into a respected leader who had changed the course of the Apache Wars. His success had come not from abandoning his military training, but from expanding it to include knowledge and wisdom drawn from the people he had been sent to fight. The invisible warfare techniques that had once seemed like madness had proven to be the key to victory and lasting peace in the American Southwest.